Hello and welcome to the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. This is your regular update for all your tillage news and advice. The wet weather continues across the country and most soils are now quite wet with water standing in otherwise reasonably dry fields. Planting is all but stopped on heavier soils, but there's still some planting progress being made on lighter soils. However, if the current weather continues much longer, planting will be stalled altogether. For crops sown but not emerged yet, the wet soil conditions present a greater challenge for plant establishment, which may result in eventual low plant stands. The Plough One Pass has been the tool of choice over the past few weeks. However, most farmers perhaps rightly decided against rolling and also applying a pre-emerge herbicide to these freshly planted fields. A different weed management strategy needs to be adopted for these fields, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Ciaran Collins, a tillage specialist, to chat through some weed options that can be used in these fields. Ciaran, given the very wet weather at the moment, how much area is planted across the country, and are there regional differences between, say, the northeast and maybe down your part of the country in Cork?
There certainly are regional differences, Michael, anyway. Based on what we're seeing around the country, there's far better progress made in the northern half of the country, especially in the northeast. I think there was obviously a little bit earlier sown, which would be normal, and certainly better progress made there. Obviously, as you mentioned, the wet weather in the last week or 10 days has had a big impact, because they would have been, big weeks for planting. And I just had a look at the Met Éireann data there this morning, and, the last 7 days, Cork Airport plus 182%. Dublin Airport is nearly up to over 3% of normal for that week, and Oak Park over 200%. So you can see, that's having an effect, and I suppose it may have a knock-on effect going forward as well.
Well, certainly around me here in Carlow, there's water lying in pretty much all fields, and I haven't seen water lying in a number of different fields for a couple of years now. Certainly last year was a really, really nice year and very kind year, but geez, we're back into the wetness now, certainly. And in terms of, Ciaran, in terms of the amount of crops that are planted of winter wheat in comparison to maybe the previous years, or winter barley in comparison to previous years, any idea where they're sitting at the moment?
Yeah, I suppose I was just interested in the Farmers Journal survey there that they did last week. And I suppose the headline that jumped out at me was like that 51% had between 81 and 100% done. So like there's another 50% that are below, 50% of growers that are below 50 or 80% of their area sown. So there is quite a bit to be done based on that, I suppose in terms of wheat, I think that's less troublesome. We had in around 60,000 hectares last year. There certainly was some wheat sown early before winter barley, maybe in some areas, And I suppose the other thing about winter wheat, we often get to this stage of the year and we think that the area won't be sown, and you get a few days and there'll be a bit of smash and grab with ploughs and one passes after maize, maybe beet, potatoes, that kind of thing. And the wheat area can creep up there with a little bit of sowing maybe in early November. Now winter barley, I think, is a different story. And I just did a little bit of analysis this morning. If you pick out the big counties for winter barley, so you're looking at, say, Cork, Louth, Tipperary, Kildare, Meath, Wexford. So I think there's reasonable progress made in all of those bar Cork. Now Cork would be the biggest one, and like the seed trade would tell me that there's a real lack of appetite and low demand for seed, particularly in Cork, for winter barley, maybe a little bit so in Wexford as well. So like we had in around, I think it was 73,000 hectares of winter barley last year. It's very hard to put a figure on it at the minute, but sown could be as low as 50, maybe up to 60, but I think that's probably would be optimistic, I'd say, Michael.
And oats, Ciaran, will be generally planted a little bit later than everything else. Do you think there's many of those gone in at the moment?
I would say very little in the southern half, possibly some in the northern half, but I would say it's certainly trending behind normal as well, Michael. Yeah.
So as the year kind of marches on, I just happen to notice out of the corner of my eye a big flock of crows on a particular field over there, and that's something I think farmers might have in mind over the next number of weeks when they're planting. Just in terms of of what's planted maybe over the last couple of weeks when it has started to get that little bit wetter, what sort of seedbed conditions are out there, do you think, and will that affect plants coming through?
Yeah, I traveled a good bit of the country in the last couple of days, and I suppose it is notable driving around where you would see sort of water lying in fields and places. And I think there is certainly some patchy emergence in places. Now, the earlier sown are fine, I think, by and large, but maybe some of the more recent ones, especially some winter barley now that sort of was sown there before the weather broke, and has got that rain that we spoke about earlier. So certainly there will be some issues with establishment there. Now, I suppose on a more positive side, if you look at soil temperatures over the last 7 days, they're actually quite high. They're 3 to 4 degrees above normal in the key areas. So you're talking about between 12 and 12.8. So I suppose that is a positive in terms of, establishment would be a little bit quicker than we might have expected. So I suppose that will help, but certainly the heavy rain and those wet seed beds will affect establishment. There's no doubt.
And I suppose a quick word, I suppose, in terms of seed rates. Obviously, as the weeks go by, seed rates need to increase. And certainly the wetter it gets and the smash and grab, as you talked about earlier, trying to get in through small bits of breaks of weather and a kind of play on one pass type system. Where or what sort of target seeds per meter squared should people be on at this stage? Maybe for wheat, I don't know. Arguably, is it getting a bit late for barley even now?
It is definitely getting late for barley. I think maybe there might be some scope for barley on really dry ground, but once you start to nose into November, it's barley is really high risk, I suppose, really. So in terms of wheat, I think you're talking about targeting 280 to 300 seeds at least. Probably over 300 at this stage, I suppose, really. But I think the key one will be the day that you're sowing is to try and estimate the percentage establishment, because that is a big factor in terms of your seed rate. If conditions are good, which, we can get them good there in early November, you might get 80-85% establishment. But if things are a bit sticky, you certainly would want to be allowing for that, and maybe at 75% establishment and that, so that's going to take you, over 200 kilos per hectare, heading into 13 and a half stone in old money, depending on 1,000 grain weight.
Yeah, it's a pretty big seeding rate, and people, I suppose, need to keep that in mind, because I think out there, the likes of Graham, which is one of the most popular wheats out there, it has quite a high 1,000 grain weight this year, so therefore you do need just to put more seed in.
Yeah, and I suppose the other risk, Michael, is the costs.
Sure.
We can't take our eye off the ball. I mean, you're increasing costs with those high seed rates. Seed is obviously more expensive this year, and then you're running into risk of, like you said there, the crows and weather conditions. So it needs to be assessed fairly well before you pull out the drill, I think.
And talking about pest issues, I just see certainly around me quite a bit of cereals that were planted maybe over the last 2 and maybe even 3 weeks. Very little or very few of them have been rolled. Is that a good thing or a bad thing, do you think, at the moment?
Sure. I suppose it's both. Not to have it rolled ahead of heavy rain is obviously a good thing. That's something we always recommend, is to, if you're expecting heavy rain just after sowing, just don't roll it. You avoid capping and water running off, which can cause a lot of problems. But as you say, the negative is from the pest perspective. There have been some reports of slug damage in recent days. So, I suppose fields after oilseed rape in particular, or fields with a history of slug damage, I'd be getting out there and baiting and having a look, and I suppose it is difficult to apply slug pellets this weather as well, because obviously they do break down quite quickly in wet weather. So I think it's just keeping an eye on them the whole time, and especially the crops that haven't emerged yet, because slugs will hollow out seed and the damage is done before you might notice. So I think it's getting out, having a look, really, Michael, is the key there.
So am I right in saying, if I can remember rightly, just go out with a kind of a large slate, put a little bit of muesli down underneath it, leave it there for 24 hours, come back after that. And for cereals, the threshold is around 4 slugs. Am I right?
4 to 5.
4 to 5 underneath it. So if you have 4 to 5 in the defined areas, you do have an issue, and you probably do need to take action really at that stage.
Yeah, I think that's the threshold from an IPM perspective. Yeah.
Okay. So in terms of then the other one I really want to talk about, really, I suppose, and we've been a long time getting to it, but weed control. I suppose our general advice would be, if you can get a pre-emerge application on before the crop emerges, you're going to probably more than likely get a much better weed control. How much of the, I suppose, maybe the the area out there that's planted over maybe the last 3 weeks have received a pre-emerge herbicide, do you think?
I think it's probably quite low. And when weather is difficult, it was a lot easier to do it last year, but when weather is difficult at sowing and broken, it is more difficult now. Having said that, I think growers, in fairness, recognize where the problems are. And, if someone has a brome issue or that, I think, especially those earlier sown ones, people would have, and I've seen that people have made a conscious decision to get in pre-em. So I suppose you would hope that some of those earlier sown ones would have had a pre-em, and that will be a major benefit in terms of controlling the likes of brome.
In a year like this, we can often get being very wet soil, and perhaps even some of the pre-emerges that have already kind of washing through the soil. And new meadowgrass can often be a much bigger problem in a year like this than other years. What's your view on that?
Yeah, look, without a doubt, I suppose, like we mentioned, if we do get patchy emergence, obviously that leaves light there for the likes of annual meadowgrass to get in. And I suppose the other point as well, in wet seed beds, apart from DFF, like most residual herbicides are primarily root acting, so they move through the soil to the wheat rooting zone before they take effect. So if you've got very wet soils, obviously those actives could move maybe slightly deeper, into the crop root zone, and you can have effects there as well. So how effective residual herbicides will be, I suppose we'll just have to assess it. But certainly the wet weather may have had some effects there,
So where a pre-emerge wasn't applied and crops are either only just coming to the ground or still to come to the ground, what are the options for growers now? Again, with a little bit of the grass weed control in mind, as well as the broadleaf weed control.
Yeah, you said it there, Michael, and I think especially in winter barley, obviously, because you don't have the backdoor options like you have in wheat. But like, I would be targeting annual meadowgrass, because our grass weeds in general, but certainly annual meadowgrass, because you do have a backdoor in your broadleaf weeds in general. So I suppose our experience has been that whether it's pendimethalin or flufenicet, chlortalluron, prosulfocarb, that are in the likes of Firebird, Stomp, Defy, those type products, they do work best when they're applied pre-emergence. But to be fair, we've got good control of annual meadowgrass when they're applied early post-emergence. So I think the key one there is, and again, weather conditions will dictate, but if you can get in before the annual meadowgrass starts to tiller, you'll get a reasonable job done on that. So it's trying to get in as early post-emergence, I suppose, as weather will allow, and just maybe avoid that sort of peri-emergence stage, because that can certainly stress the crop at that stage.
Tell me, what does peri-emergence look like for a farmer out in the field, digging around, looking at crops coming through? What does that?
The easiest way I kind of describe it is, it's obviously when the shoot is breaking ground. So when you're just, the sun is out in the crop and you just look down and you can just barely see the lines, the crop is just breaking ground. That's, I suppose, maybe a way of describing peri-emergence. Okay. So just to avoid that stage, or even the other point as well is, avoid spraying crops under stress, and they can be under stress from, weather conditions at this time of year as well. So, just to skip on. For a lot of people, it might coincide with the insecticide timing as well at the 2 to 3 leaf stage. So generally, if you can get in at the 2 leaf stage, your meadowgrass won't be gone too far, and you'll get reasonable control of meadowgrass at that stage.
And speaking of which, in terms of the development of the meadowgrass versus the development of, say, the barley that, as you say, we're kind of just talking about here, do they develop at pretty much the same stage? So if your barley's at 2 leaf stage, well, sure, meadowgrass must be the same, or is there a differential there? And what I'm thinking about here really is that you made the point, I think, rightly, around trying to get in on time with these post-emergent herbicides to target those grass weeds. Is there a difference there? I mean, can that extend all the way into, I suppose, at this stage, all the way into December or mid-December, even now at this stage?
Yeah, well, firstly, as you say, Michael, sooner the better is the first bit of advice. The annual meadowgrass will quite often be maybe a leaf behind. So maybe when you're at the 2 to 3 leaf stage there with your crop, you often find the meadowgrass is maybe a leaf or that behind. So it does give an opportunity to spray it at that stage. And as I say, we especially with the likes of flufenicet-based herbicides, and Defy would be particularly good as well. We've had good control of annual meadowgrass at that stage in recent seasons.
And when you mentioned aphicides there, just on the way by there, the weather is very mild, although according to Louise McNamara here in Oak Park, aphids don't particularly like to rain necessarily. However, there is a lot of crops up already. What's your thinking as regards an aphicide for the crops that are already through the ground?
Yeah, I'd be sticking to the advice in terms of sowing date, really. That's the first thing. So those early sown are still high risk. Having said that, and as you've said there, when you go to collect aphids these days, after wind or rain, there's generally very few. So that, like, flight is obviously inhibited by those weather conditions. So I suppose that is a factor in helping to reduce the pressure this year, which is a positive, I suppose. Having said that, those early sown crops, when you get into them, it's in some cases it's not hard to find aphids, and if you have that scenario, I think an insecticide is warranted in those early sown.
Okay, so stick to the normal advice that we have, I suppose, had out there for a good number of years at this stage. Final question I want to ask you, Ciaran, as regards a kind of a top up for a pre-emerge, there is a share of crops, maybe not a huge amount, but certainly a share of crops that are probably now at the probably early tillering stage, maybe this stage, crops that were put in perhaps maybe the 20th or 22nd of September. Do those crops, do you think, need a bit of a top up in terms of this annual meadowgrass control, given that it is so wet?
It depends on a number of factors. If a pre-em was used and your target is annual meadowgrass, and if the pre-em was, say, just for argument's sake, something like pendimethalin, which is quite persistent, it's got very strong residual activity and it wouldn't be leached that easily from the soil. I think in general you should be okay. I think the ones where a top up might be required is where you're targeting brome. And quite often we have found in the past where brome is an issue, getting back in, especially maybe in winter barley scenarios, with a top up with something like flufenicet, your Firebird mate, and there's lots of generics available. They're good value as well. That top up, post-stem certainly does help to increase the level of control. So I'd be keeping an eye on that. It depends on my target weed, but certainly for brome in the winter barley scenario, I think a top up may be warranted. I suppose in wheat it's slightly different because you do have other actives that you can use later on, the likes of Broadway Star and Pacifica and that as well, so that broadens the range for wheat.
Sure. I think you came to it a number of different times, Ciaran. I think the key to all of this is get out in your fields and walk and have a look, whether it happens to be slugs, what happens to be aphids, or what happens to be the weeds that are coming through without a pre-emerge or a pre-emerge is there. You just need to get out and constantly walk your crops and see what's there.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
Ciaran, thanks very much for your time once again. Your mind of information. Thanks for going through all of that. And look, we'll hopefully have you back shortly on the show again.
No bother. Thanks, Michael.
So that's it for this week, and my thanks to Ciaran for joining me on the podcast. Finally, don't forget, if you enjoy the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, review and follow on Apple Podcasts or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening. I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.